Hello, and welcome to another episode of Untraditionally Traditional, a podcast with me, Brittany Duncan, a millennial homemaker. Join me each week as I share all the things I've learned that make keeping your home, garden, and life running smoothly, all while working. If you are enjoying the podcast, please be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcasting app so you get the episodes downloaded straight to you every Monday. Now, on to today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to Untraditionally Traditional, a millennial homemaker. I am your host, Brittany Duncan, and today I'm joined by not one, not two, but three very special guests. Anyone who knows me, or if you've listened to this podcast for long, you know that I'm passionate about cooking food, and this year I have become even more passionate about where my food comes from, what's in it, how it's grown or raised, and how the animals I put on our table live out their days before they make it into our kitchen. I warn you that the more you start to explore where your food comes from and how it's produced, the deeper you continue to dive. For me, it's been the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes, but luckily, when you know better, you do better. So today I bring a conversation to you with three guests who are helping to better the way we think about, grow, raise, and get food to our tables. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So we'll put some names to those voices and educate the listeners a little bit about each of you and your farms. So I'll have you introduce you, your farm, and if you also let the listeners know where your farm's located and how long you've been there and farming. I know for some of you, the time that you've been at your farm versus the time that you've been farming are different.
Well, my name is Elizabeth McKinney, and my husband and I started Windy Sage Farms in Ontario, Oregon. 5 years ago. We both were born and raised on small farms where we basically just homesteaded, used, the opportunity as our families grew to learn and know about where our food comes from. But we started farming in 2018. So we both kind of took a step away and got married, grew up, all those things that you do. And now 23 years later, started our own farm. So it's been pretty cool.
Nice. That's awesome.
All right, I'll go next. My name is Valerie Tim. My husband, Alex, started Vista Farms 3 years ago. We're located 20 minutes south of Boise, Idaho. And we really just decided that we wanted to take a more active role in our own food production. And so we just dove in with both feet. Not only are we learning the ropes as first generation farmers, we decided to make it even more difficult on ourselves by farming dry land in the high desert. So that presents a lot of really unique challenges. We grow lavender, we raise Angus beef, and we're expanding on our pork and egg production.
Y'all have heard me talk about the lavender. It's awesome. And the beef.
Yes.
And Wilder?
Yeah, my name is Wilder Jones. I'm located in Glenns Ferry, Idaho on the Snake River. And I grew up on my father's highly diverse and relatively large certified organic farm. That's King's Crown Organic Farm. And I still work for him to this day. And I came back to the farm in 2016 because I was just a little fed up with school and had been just diving deep and scouring the internet for all things permaculture and biodynamics. And I just was working at a food co-op in Bozeman, and I had just known that I cared about my food, and it was becoming more and more pressing and pertinent every day. And as I was at a permaculture design course, I was like, man, I need to get some land. And I just had to take a look around and realize that if I went home to Southern Idaho, that I could have all of the creative authority to pursue alternative ways of living and alternative ways of growing food. And my father, who's already a contrarian, doesn't take any convincing. And in 22, last year, I started a raw milk micro dairy known as Wild Spaces Farm here on the portion of the farm that I live on. And that's a grass-fed, entirely grass-based micro dairy serving raw dairy products here in Southern Idaho, along with a little pastured eggs now.
Love it. Can you explain for the listeners that might not know what micro dairy is versus non-micro dairy?
Yeah, I guess it's just not macro.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's micro now compared to the souped up industrial scale of dairying. So I've talked to a lot of old timers that are quick to remind me that what I'm doing is not novel, and it's true. Every dairy used to be small in nature, and there was many of them. And so I'm in the like 10 cows is my herd base. I currently milk 5. I'd probably double the herd base, but only ever want to milk 10 at a time. And certainly 40 cows is not big if we're talking about the dairies that are 1,000 to 10,000 cows. So there's
Exactly.
a lot of tiers, but I guess us micro dairy and people are talking double to single digits.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And it's neat to look at that you're, you know, almost not going backwards, but I'm reading this book right now called The Unsettlers. And it's basically about like, kind of reversing what you're doing. And it seems like that's what you're doing. And when they say like, well, that's not a new concept, but it's contrary to how modern farming is done and how most dairy is produced. And Elizabeth, I'm curious from, your time that you spent away from farming and going back, did you find that how you had been, raised as to what farming is and how you operate are different, or are they kind of along the same line?
Oh, absolutely. It was actually quite eye-opening to come back to that lifestyle after being in the corporate world. And I traveled and I was, it was a completely different world for me. Out of high school, married, got in the corporate world, and then bought our farm in 2018 and started, diving back into that. It was incredible how much had it was almost like people were trying too hard. It was almost like I noticed that things were being changed unnecessarily. There was things that were being done, just like, while they're talking about permaculture, like that didn't have a name to it necessarily when I was a kid growing up, but that's what we did. That's just what everybody did, and so the traditional ways of farming are coming back. And what was comical to a degree, and I don't mean to sound disrespectful in any way, but what was comical to a degree to me was that it was now popular. Now it was a fad. Now it was something people were doing because it was cool. It was, whereas when I was a kid growing up, that's just what you did. That's just how you farmed. And so I think to a degree, it's been a little bit eye opening, but then it was also a bit of a learning curve for me because there was names to things now, whereas before it was just, hey, that's what we always did. Somebody would say a fancy name to something and I'd be like, oh, you mean, grazing, like,
Yeah.
what? We didn't have it wasn't strip grazing or rotational grazing or anything. It was just grazing. Like, that's just what you did. So of course there's things to learn. But yeah, it was an interesting comeback for sure. There was a lot of things that were similar yet different.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's the thing, I think about it a lot. Like, when do you call yourself a farmer? Because there's the hobby farm, or, you have backyard chickens, or, you're raising for just your family, or you're selling it, or do you need to be working, doing that full time and have employees? Like, what is the, standard? And there isn't, like, there's so many different ways of doing it now, which is um wonderful. And so it kind of brings me into the next area that I wanted to talk about, which is each of your farms are different in how they operate and the kind of farming that you do. And I know that there's a lot of misconceptions that come with it, whether it's pasteurized dairy versus regular dairy. Cows are bad for the environment. Homesteading must be your full-time job in order to be making it work. And I'm curious what each of you finds to be the biggest myth or misconception that you've found through your farm or through getting into farming, like something you thought was different.
Well, I just have to say that it is really refreshing to hear Wilder say micro farm and kind of hear that there's a comparison there to more of the big industrial commercial agriculture, because I feel a lot of the times like a first generation farmer and a new farm starting out only 3 years into this, that I don't even know if I deserve to say the word farm sometimes, just because we're small. And it really brings me back to, well, that's how it always was. It wasn't these large, just more industrial kind of ways of doing things. And I always think about that kind of Amazon Prime mentality that we live with in society today, that instant gratification, that you can just click the button and add it to your cart and it shows up at your door. There's a lot of convenience to that. And I think it's great in a lot of ways, but the price we pay is that there's no connection to your food or appreciation for how it got there. And so moving from someone as that was a consumer to now trying to get into being a producer, I've really been able to see the difference and appreciate how much work goes into getting that food to your plate. I think we lose that in our food supply chains today, that direct connection to our food and what it takes to raise it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Valerie. The one of the biggest misconceptions that we faced when we first started our farm, and it took me a while to figure out how to even answer this question or to respond when people would say this, because what do you see when you drive anywhere this area? You see lots of row crop. You see lots of wheat and corn and potatoes and sugar beets. And so when we said, oh, we have a farm, Windy Sage Farms, or we'd hand somebody our business card or something, and they'd say, well, what do you grow? And in their mind, they're thinking large scale. And then several times people would say, well, that's not a farm. And I'm thinking, well, what is a farm to you? Because something switched at one point, something switched in people's minds that a farm is large row crop style agriculture. And then if you said, well, you had animals, they said, well, then that's a ranch. And I'd say, no, that's not a ranch. And I actually looked it up because I was very curious, and it was based on like how many acres you had and what type of animals you raised considered a ranch versus a farm. And of course, who really cares about those kind of details? But to me, it was an interesting fact that every time we said, Windy Sage Farms, they'd say, oh, what do you grow? Where are you? What's your row crops? What are you putting in this year? And we're like, what are you talking about? But just that misconception was kind of interesting. I think that because small farms and small farm to table type of farms have become more popular, even over the last 5 years, that question doesn't get asked nearly as often, which is quite interesting to me. But it was a weird misconception that I never would have thought would have been an issue when I started introducing our farm to people.
Yeah, which is so interesting because I imagine for those single crop farmers, you're not feeding your family from your farm off of only potatoes. So if you don't have a dairy cow or poultry, eggs, produce outside of that, then you either rely on some kind of trade system or you're also being a consumer to other farms. And so it is an interesting concept of whether you're like a self-sustaining farm or you're producing for other people or a combination.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not to sound disrespectful to anybody who thought that or said that, but that was the conversation that I would have with them was, okay, I appreciate that you grow potatoes. We have a little bit wider spread because we're smaller scale, so we can, and this is what we offer. And it was a very it was, like I said, it was an interesting conversation I had with several large big time farmers locally here, because we did actually a booth at our local fair the first year that we opened our farm. And so our booth, of course, was buzzing with all these farmers because they thought we were like, the new big farm in town. And I'm like, no, we're not. Like, I explained to him our acreage, and we have like 13 acres of pasture, but then the rest is dry land. We have 54 acres total. And so, it's just sagebrush. And they're like, well, what do you grow? And I'm like, grass.
Sage, more sage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to
Yeah.
Idaho and Oregon.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions all the time that I'm trying to break down and reframe. Um, And I can go over so many. The micro dairy itself is a great like leading edge. I mean, everything we do from not pasteurizing the milk to milking once a day, only being on grass, not feeding grain, like all I've ran into so many people, ex-dairymen, people that milked cows when they were kids. You had a milk cow with the family, just so many things that I'm saying like, no, I don't do it like that. And
Mm-hmm.
no, I don't want to ever do it like that, and I don't want to milk cows in the winter. I only want to do it when the grass is green. And so just kind of constantly running into all of the things that I do with my dairy are contrary to what we've learned. And um for me it's like I mean, and maybe I'm sure Valerie and Elizabeth are both in staunch industrial farming areas, but it's like I'm trying to break down even how I dress, like I wear shorts, I'm comfortable. Farm days don't have to start at 5 a.m. Farm days don't have to end at 9 p.m. Like there's just all this stuff that's like you can I'm trying to break it all down, to figure out what is a farm. Like we've all asked ourselves this question, and even in this interview right now, as we try to define it, it's not worth defining. I'd say odds are you grow more food than you can eat, and that makes you a farm, even if you're in an urban setting. And so, yeah, I'm always interested in breaking down misconceptions, and I think the bigger ones that I deal with are like my own thought process about like how to integrate my father's legacy as he finishes his farming career, and how do I like I can't do what he did. There's no way I can. It's going to change. And I can never be as good as he was at some of the things that he does. And so I have to figure out how to be a generational farmer. And luckily we don't owe anything to the bank, but there'll be little things like that have destroyed other generational farms many times over. And so I have to figure out that. And so that's a big one for me, more than whether or not I decide to wear pants or shorts.
Yeah, it's a great point because no matter what scale you're at, and I think we've gotten so far away from, well, I think society in general really appreciating our farmers because of that instant gratification. We go to Winco or Trader Joe's, or if you live in a major city, you're getting it delivered to your doorstep. You don't even have to look at the ingredient pack, like the ingredients, to decide whether or not you want to purchase it, where it came from, that kind of thing. And so, like with those decisions, we've gotten so far away of thinking where our food comes from that we don't think about the decisions that you all make to decide whether you're only going to milk your cattle in the summer, or your milk cows in the summer, and what that means for the costs that you charge for your milk. You're still feeding them all year round and storing them, even though you're not selling the milk during the winter months. Or for Valerie, like that, you need a meat processor and packaging, and that's a whole other element of it. And so there's all these different things that as the general consumer we don't think about. And I think another huge thing, or at least that I have found, is that it's more expensive to buy locally, or that good quality of food. And so but it's worth it once you start figuring out what it means. Why is it so much more expensive? Ground beef shouldn't be $2.99 or $3.99 a pound. Your milk shouldn't be $1.67 for a gallon, or whatever it is sometimes. I think more and more, as we start breaking down those misconceptions and people start realizing what it means, and kind of a red flag going up when they do see those prices, maybe that's the goal, so that not anybody can be a farmer, but that more people, you don't have to be that full-time, wake up at 5 a.m. in your overalls to be a little more local and sustainable. There's like that age-old saying, if it's fast and cheap, it won't be good. If it's cheap and good, it won't be fast. And if it's fast and good, it won't be cheap. And I think all those things are, exactly what pertains to farming. And this whole episode actually was inspired by a conversation I had with Valerie after, she was posting on her Instagram about their beef shares, and was saying, like, we don't have beef all the time, and we don't usually sell just a pound at a time because we're a farm, not a factory, and it isn't that instant gratification that you get.
Yeah, can I touch on something real quick there?
Yeah.
On the conversation of value, when eggs went crazy high in the grocery store, I was thrilled. I was thrilled because it finally put us in a place where people could start to understand our pricing with our eggs. We have been at $6 a dozen since we opened our doors. And that actually, back in the beginning when we started offering eggs, which we didn't start offering eggs right away because obviously we had infrastructure, we had to grow our own chicks and all of that. But see, people don't bring that into consideration, especially if they're going for high production egg layers, things like that. And being a smaller farm and being wanting to do more heritage breeds and things like that, I finally did the math, and I did the math early on, but I did the math again this last year when our feed prices like quadrupled in price. And at $6 a dozen with our cartons, our labels, our time, which you pretty much can't put a price tag on, our feed, because we do free range our birds. However, during certain times of the year, you have to feed your chickens. You can't not feed your chickens. The chickens themselves and how long it takes to get them to the point where they're laying eggs. We were making 13 cents a dozen after selling them for $6 a dozen.
Yeah.
So, and trying to put that into perspective for our buyers. And I did actually have to have that conversation at one point because one of our local grocery stores, a little organic market here in Ontario, wanted to carry our eggs. And I was thrilled for that opportunity. But when I started putting out the price for them, they wanted to have the price at $6 a dozen for their customers. And I said, well, then in that case, you wouldn't be making anything because you're going to buy them from us at that price. And so, there was just a time frame, and as the eggs was a good example where I think people finally started to understand to a degree what it actually cost a farmer. And, especially at a smaller scale, we don't have hundreds of chickens. Right now we have about 67 layers. And that does us for what we need. But there's a lot of these factory farms that obviously they can pump out eggs and do much better than us, but you're getting what you pay for. And it's definitely not a quality egg.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, I mean, like the animal care on that side is very, very different. And yeah, I had to laugh at the same thing when egg prices went up, because we now have 6 chickens. They're 8 weeks old, and I knew it before we got it. Like you get chickens because you want chickens. Do not get them because you want cheap eggs, because you're going to spend way more on those chickens, especially if you're, doing the urban chicken thing. Like they have a cute coop. We bought the paint to paint it. And like, I'm starting to do the math and I'm like, man, these chickens are getting expensive. And so, pay the price for the eggs that are, raised in humane ways with happy chickens. And you can see Elizabeth's chickens and they're very, very happy. I see them online all the time.
Yes.
So something I love about all your operations is that they're educational, like whether it's through your social media platforms or your websites, classes, or conversations at the farmers market, farm visits, that kind of thing. All of you have been educators on your practices. And I know, Elizabeth, that you especially have made education a large part of what you offer to the community. So can you tell the audience a little bit more about the kind of things you teach and why you made the decision to start offering homesteading classes?
Absolutely. We, first of all, we were wanting to, again, just kind of break some misconceptions on backyard farming and small farms. That phrase hobby farm became a very commonly used term. And in what most people, I think, decided that the word hobby farm meant that you had some animals, but they were all pets and you were never planning on raising them to produce food for you. Maybe your chickens did, so you had a couple eggs you'd get here and there and you grew a garden. That's what a hobby farmer was. they had a donkey and a, pet pig, and those were hobby farmers.
Yeah.
And so when we decided to start offering classes, it was again just to kind of start changing the perspective and helping um, break some of those misconceptions on what you could do with your space and how you could, in an inexpensive and efficient way, raise some of your own food. So some of the classes that we've done so far, goat's milk soap has been one of our most popular classes. We actually don't raise goats, but we get our goat's milk from a local farm right down the road. And we love that they are a corn-free, soy-free goat's milk. And so they're getting the benefits of a good high quality goat's milk when we make our soap. And, sounds like, okay, soap's just fun. You just have a fun little soap there. Well, I can't tell you the joy I get from washing my baby in a soap, knowing that I made it. I know exactly where the products came from. I know exactly what ingredients are in it, and it is clean and it's got nutrition in it. Same thing with our beef tallow body lotion, deodorant classes. Just it's almost like it just empowers people to realize that, okay, yeah, you could go and buy a really great body lotion somewhere, but do you actually feel 100% confident with every drop of ingredient that's in that? Because unfortunately, we're finding that you really can't. You can scan it with a fancy bar or app and see what the ingredients are, but do you really know what all's in that? So again, it's just more like empowerment. And now on the animal side of our classes, we've done rabbit raising classes, how to raise meat rabbits. That's one of the things that we do here on our farm. And for meat rabbits, people think it's difficult, or they have just kind of this idea in their head that that sounds like a lot of work. It's really not. It's quite simple. And the process of birth to butcher is quite quick. And so, giving people the idea of how that works. We did a chicken raising class from baby chicks. You buy your baby chicks, and what do you do now? From here to there. And again, just busting myths. The class that we had, for our chick raising class was our most popular. We had 67 people here, I think, on the day of our chick class. And I mean, the questions were just boom, 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 all these questions. And there are all these questions that were like totally these, myths that people come up with on the internet when they Google how to raise chicks or whatever. And it was really great because it got those conversations going, whether it was the small background farm or whether it was, the urban farm or the city folks that just wanted 3 hens, 5 hens, or whether it was, we had one group here that they were really interested in doing pastured chickens, and they wanted to know, what would this take? How much does it cost? What did you do infrastructure? How did you build your coops? All of that. So it's, it's all things combined with empowerment, encouragement, education, people seeing it hands-on. I mean, you can YouTube anything. You can learn how to do anything on YouTube, but getting your hands in the dirt, getting your hands right there and working with people side by side. Our rabbit butchering class, for example, I mean, we had moms. I don't know if this is okay, hopefully.
Yeah, please, dive in.
We had moms with babies on their backs in their little baby carriers butchering rabbits. And she, when she's done, she's like, not only is this great because our kids are learning too. We had kids there, they're learning, they're understanding where their food comes from, but it was quick. And she was surprised with how clean it was and how efficient it was, and how, right there, all of a sudden now there's dinner, and it's empowering, I think, because as soon as they're done with something simple like that task that to us, we take advantage of because we think, oh, that's just a simple thing we do all the time. But to somebody who's never experienced that, and you take that, those questions, those worries, those concerns away from them, when you show them the simplicity of it, it just blows their mind. They're just so excited about it. So the classes have been incredibly fun and very empowering to even me. Every time I do a class and people walk away just feeling great about it, I'm like, this was awesome.
So I'm sure you realize like how far your knowledge has come too, like the things that you now do second nature, that you remember, like, oh yeah, I remember being nervous about that or not
absolutely
knowing how that worked.
Absolutely. And, the goat's milk soap is a really good example of that. I could not find anywhere local to learn how to make soap. And I had a good friend who was telling me she would eventually teach me, but she even kept saying, it's really difficult and it's got a lot of chemical components and you have to be really careful and this and that. And I'm just like nervous about
Mhm.
learning how to make goat's milk soap. And so finally, after multiple YouTube videos, lots of trial and error, I kind of made my own recipe that combined some of the best of what I'd learned. And this took me a course of like 6 months to perfect the soap, and
Mhm.
then realized that it's not actually that scary if you know how to do it and if you are confident with it. So a lot of the women that came to the goat's milk soap class, they're like nervous. Oh, we have to work with lye. Oh, that's nerve wracking. That's scary. It's chemical. And I'll say, no, you'll be fine. Trust me. Trust the process. You'll work it out. It'll all work out. And by the end, they're going, that was way easier than the internet made it sound.
Mhm.
So, because it sounds so scary to try to work with something like that when you've never touched it in your life.
Yeah, the internet can be a good place or a bad place. There's you're going to find the polar opposite of every opinion, as like especially for livestock and that kind of thing. There's the like backyardchickens.com, and I can't tell you how many times it's like, should I, paint down to, when I first started reading, they're like, you have to use like a natural paint, like get milk paint. I'm just gonna put it out there. Milk paint sucks and it does not look good. And it was like I basically painted the coop and then had to repaint it. And then other people were like, no, like don't put your chickens in there while the paint is drying, obviously. But like once it cures, it's fine.
Mhm.
You can use like a regular outdoor paint. And so there's all sorts of schools of thought and what you're feeding them, like the whether they are free range or not, or the level of protein in the food during the winter, all those different things. It's like
Yeah.
the WebMD of farming. But
Yes.
for Valerie and Wilder, have y'all found that like what Elizabeth's doing is kind of the outlier? Like, do you find that other farmers, and like particularly established farmers are like willing to share information and like show you the ropes of like, this is how we did it and, get education? Or do you find that it's harder to get education and it's kind of like self-taught trial and error?
I think for me, what Elizabeth is describing, and I've taken some of her classes too. It's really wonderful to learn from someone in person and ask those questions. The internet is overwhelming, as you kind of alluded to, and a lot of people still do want that in-person education. I think for me personally, there's that generation gap of I don't have someone to learn from. I don't know how to find a farmer to call them, and get that kind of mentorship. So you turn to social media, but that's not where all of the, generations of farmers that came before us are today. So
Mhm.
as a first generation farmer, trying to make those connections and kind of go beyond the book has been really difficult. But there are resources out there, and making connections and meeting Elizabeth, for example, on social media is one of the ways that we've been able to kind of get around that. But a lot of it is for us paying for your education through experience. I think I've shared that with you before, Brittany.
Mhm.
It's a lot of trial and error, and just being okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful what Elizabeth is offering. I wish there was some groovy classes near me. I do. I guess I'd give a shout out to Peaceful Belly Farm in Marsing. They do some pretty engaging activities that have probably empowered some people, I would imagine, just from the themes that I see. And um, for me, I'm always trying to tap my father's wisdom and any experience he has, and he's pretty forthcoming. And also, like, I kind of have to get off my. I'm pretty fundamentalist when it comes to inputs in your farm, and so sometimes I disregard my neighbors, um, and they still do have a lot to offer. And it's just the other day, someone who's an arborist was here and telling my friend, all like, the four things you need to do through the summer so that you have good peaches. And I just don't do any of those things. Um, but that it's not that there's not something to glean from there. And so I try to be receptive of all the information, and you never know who has it. Like someone next door does know how to can, they just don't like doing it anymore and haven't been inspired, but they'll teach you. And so there's lots of community resources around us. The generation's not entirely gone yet. And I think for anybody starting out, like, go to the conferences, go to the meetups, go to the farmers markets, ask the questions, and find a mentor. Like, really find someone to be in your pocket. And Peter Dill in Emmett at St. John's Organics has been my dairying mentor. And that's been like, it's made all the difference. And him and I cannot talk for less than 2 hours, it seems. So it's just like super valuable that I have someone that I can call. I can't see it. I can't go see it all the time. It's kind of far away, but I definitely have someone that has walked the water before me, and they might not be in the state, depending on what you're up to, So I think it's really important to find a mentor.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's for the average consumer, it can be intimidating even at the farmers market. You feel like the people that are there from their farms, that they know so much, and you don't want to seem ignorant by asking questions, about the products that they're carrying, or you don't want to be rude, like, why is this chicken so much more expensive than chicken in the grocery store? But I would encourage you to ask those questions, because if they're there, it means that they're really passionate about what they are doing, and they've likely dedicated a large portion of their life and time and money to it. And so learn from them. There's probably a good reason for any question that you have why they do something the way that they do it. But again, forewarning with that, once it's hard to look back on that. I've talked about on here another book called Animal Vegetable Miracle that just talks about how most of our food is like how far it travels to before it gets to us, whether it's the things that we could grow in our state, but are still largely imported. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina for a long time, and I was always shocked when I would be in the grocery store and the majority of our seafood was not from Charleston. We're right there. We have shrimp docks. Why do we have shrimp from Indonesia? So all these strange aspects. And so I just encourage you to look into it, because it's kind of, in my mindset, you can spend money on it now or later. It will impact your health, what's in our food. And then, you're supporting locally and your neighbor. And, I've made friends through it, which is wonderful. You really get to know who your food is coming from. You're friends with your dairy farmer, you're friends with your where you get your cattle or produce from, and you can learn and maybe try things yourself, so that eventually, and start small so that we don't lose those skills. I'm shocked when we got chickens, and no judgment, Teddy, but when we got chickens and they said, well, how are you going to have eggs without a rooster? And I'm like, as a generation, we're starting to like lose the knowledge of, how we get an egg, like that, to grow carrots, like one seed equals one carrot, and how to, just simple, like pretty simple things that I don't want to see. I want to make sure that like my kids have that education, and it's not usually something that's taught in school. So I really applaud all of you for sharing that knowledge, and because it is your businesses too and your livelihood, and there's got to be that like aspect of like you're educating people that could potentially be your competition.
A lot of times when people are coming in, we've had this happen several times now. People are coming to our classes, and I encourage consumers to come to our classes. Don't just think that you're coming. For example, we had a couple, husband and wife, come to our chicken class. They had no interest in raising chickens, but they wanted to know, they wanted to see our farm. They wanted to see what we do, how we raise the chickens humanely, what we feed them, how they're raised, because they are regular egg customers. So, just on the subject of learning, it doesn't have to be because you actually want to go grow your own food. It could be just because you want to know how your farmer is raising the food that you're purchasing from them.
Hmm.
So, I know Valerie does little farm tours to have people come by. I highly encourage that because that was such an eye-opening thing for us when we first started. We do beef. We also are diving into pastured pork, and we also do lamb. And it was important for people to see, like when they purchased, a lot of times people are like, well, I don't want to see the animal before I consume it. I understand that to a degree, but they sometimes just want to see a happy animal out in the pasture. And then they go and buy something and they know, okay, that happy animal will eventually also be something that I'm going to consume. And so it just, again, it doesn't have to be because you want to learn how to do this yourself. It might just be because you actually want to have a little more knowledge behind where your food's coming from so that you can support your local farmers that way. And we are so passionate about that because I think that's where that happens, where you, like you said, do you have to have a rooster to have eggs? Why is that a thing? Why is
Right.
that a misconception?
Yeah.
Well, because people have gotten so far away from the farm, they don't. And adults, and we have nothing against kids coming to learn. We want kids to learn because they're the next generation. But adults are the ones that need to also be at the farms to learn where this food is coming from and what it's like and how these animals are being treated, because that helps close the gap
Hmm.
for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
and I
sure.
think you touched on something really important too, is that generational knowledge and just keeping it local, because so much of our food is consolidated of where it's produced, that we don't really have to ever know these things anymore in society. Going back to that, click the button, add to cart kind of thing. And for me, I grew up in a rural area. We had bring your tractor to school day, but I never knew anyone that had a tractor, and we didn't have eggs in our backyard. And I could hear the cows mooing, but I didn't know that you could buy a beef share until we started raising our own cattle, and realizing that you could buy direct from your farmer and kind of cut out that middleman with the grocery store, and really know a lot more about your food. So I think I see a lot of people, we meet a lot of people that come to our farm that are really interested in that and want to know more, and that's really exciting. I think the other thing that's interesting is, Elizabeth, you sharing, kind of what your bottom line looks like for your eggs, even though it feels like a high price. A lot of farmers today work off the farm. I think USDA did a survey in 2019 that said it's up to 96% of farmers now have off-farm income that they rely on. In the 70s, it was 37%. So we see that huge consolidation. We see that reliance of having to have your income happen off of the farm, but we still need farms. We still need our local farms to continue to produce and to share that knowledge of how to raise our own food.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody asked me at one point when we did that, well, then why do you sell eggs? And I said, because we're passionate about providing a quality product to people. It isn't about making money. And to a degree, that's kind of sad because, like you said, those statistics tell you right there, we can't make money as farmers at that level. But why do we do it? We do it because we know that uh, there's lives at stake, if you will. I mean, that might sound extreme, but there really is. We have so many customers that buy our eggs specifically because we don't feed corn or soy, and we don't spray. So, we're not considered organic because we haven't gone through those hoops yet. And we may never, but the fact that we can say that our animals are, being fed correctly is a big deal. So,
Yeah, and there's all the marketing too of, all natural, cage free, pasture raised, like happy farm, like all these things that are printed on a box that people are like, oh no, I bought happy farm eggs. Like that's not a thing. That's not regulated. It's or that cage free means there's simply four sides and not a lid,
Right.
like they can still be packed in there or they're all in a room. It doesn't, unfortunately for the consumer, unless you're really diving into it and doing your research, you might think that you're doing the right thing. And then, you're being swindled by marketing, and they're very good. Marketing is, makes a ton of money. A lot of people, that's their whole career, is to get you to believe one thing. But the only way to really know how your food is raised and what's going into it is to visit the farm. And when you lay eyes on it, at least for me, I can speak personally. I am purchasing a beef share from Valerie and Alex, and I have seen the cow that's going to be part of our beef share. And when I look at the cow, very happy. And I'm like, well, at least that cow is living out like its best days, happy in the sunshine with tons of space to roam, like food to graze on, and it's happy. I being more in Idaho now, and we drive around to other states a lot, where you pass a lot of huge cattle farms where they are packed in. And so when you see the difference between them, it's a no-brainer. But it is hard, and it takes work on your side as the consumer to do your research, read your labels. I'm willing to bet if you pick up most general packages of ground beef in the grocery store, they're going to say made in the US. It's not even going to tell you the state, because the meat's coming from multiple states and going to a processing plant. So read those labels and dive into it that way. And then I'd love for each of you to share where listeners can follow your farms and find out information about the classes that you guys have going on. And, if they're local to us, come to visit your farms, but just continue to be educated about all the different areas that y'all serve in terms of farming and agriculture.
Right now, social media is the best place to get a hold of us. We are currently working on putting together a website, but we have not gotten that finalized yet. So Windy Sage Farms, make sure there's an S on the end, just FYI. That's a new struggle. So make sure there's an S on the end of Windy Sage Farms, all one word, and that will be Instagram and Facebook. We are also on YouTube, and we're going to be starting to offer some of our classes on YouTube via subscription. So keep an eye out for that.
For Vista Farms, we are most active on Instagram. So that is Vista Farms Idaho, farms with an S as well. And we're also on Facebook. And I have been keeping this a secret. I haven't announced it yet, but we do have a website, which is vistafarmsidaho.com as well. I don't know. I guess this is where I'm launching that, or just giving that announcement. So,
honored.
Thanks, Brittany.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the opportunity.
No problem.
Yeah, my farm, the micro dairy, is Wild Spaces Farm, wildspacesfarm.com. That's the handle on Instagram and Facebook as well. And we do, 24/7 open door policy. If you want to come see the farm, to come see the animals and talk to me, odds are I'm around, because someone's got to do the milking. And so people are always welcome to come to the farm. My products are only available direct. Well, I do have one retail setting, but the Boise Farmers Market, 1500 Shoreline Drive, 9 a.m. on Saturday morning until 1 p.m. and Forest Service Park in Ketchum, Idaho, at the Wood River Farmers Market, noon to 4 p.m. on Wednesdays. And I'm also located at Six Creeks Mercantile, which is a new store here in Glenns Ferry, and Nourish Me in Ketchum, Idaho. And my father's farm, kingscrownordanics.com. Yeah, kingscrownordanics.com. And you can follow them on Instagram as well.
Well, I'm definitely going to take you up on a farm visit, and I will come visit your happy cows that are real happy cows. But listeners, I'll have all those handles linked in the show notes for you so that you can find those easily. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your days and away from your animals to come and talk to us and provide some education today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Untraditionally Traditional. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it with those special people who would love it too, and write a review. For more tips and photos of my home and garden, follow Untraditionally Traditional Pod on Instagram. Until next week, let's continue to make our homes places of joy and service to ourselves and those we share them with.